before dawn. A battering ram hits the front door of a quiet house on Calloway Street. Officer Derek Boone doesn't knock. He never does. He throws a 31-year-old woman against her own wall while neighbors press their faces to cold windows, not believing what they're seeing. Boone grins. He's already rehearsing the story he'll tell at the precinct. Nurse, alone, easy. Then his radio crackles, then another. Then every phone on the street lights up at once. Black SUVs, no plates, roll in from both ends of the block. And the man who just said, "You're finished," watches the woman he pinned to the wall look back at him with something that isn't fear. You have no idea who you just touched. If this story already has you gripping your seat, follow me, hit like, and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. The call came in at 4:47 in the morning. Not to Olivia Hayes, she was already awake. She'd been awake for an hour, sitting at her kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and a trauma report she'd been trying to finish since midnight. The ER at Westbrook Medical Center didn't slow down for paperwork, and neither did she. The report covered a particularly brutal Saturday night shift. 2 gunshot victims, 1 pediatric cardiac arrest, a construction worker who'd lost 3 fingers to an unguarded saw blade. All of them had made it. She'd written that part last. She heard the vehicles before she saw the lights. In a different life, a life she'd spent considerable effort burying, she'd been trained to identify threat by sound alone. 2 vehicles, heavy chassis, moving fast but decelerating hard. They weren't lost. They weren't passing through. They stopped directly in front of her house. She stood up from the table. The front door came off its hinges before she reached the hallway. Derek Boone was a big man who understood that size was most effective when combined with speed and surprise. He moved through her doorframe like he'd done it 100 times, because he had. Behind him came 2 uniformed officers, flashlight beams cutting through the dark hallway, bouncing off framed photographs and a coat rack, and the small ceramic pot of herbs she kept on the windowsill by the door. "Olivia Hayes!" His voice was meant to shock. It didn't. She stood at the end of the hallway in sweatpants and a faded gray long sleeve, hands open at her sides. "That's me." He was already moving. He grabbed her left arm, pivoted her into the wall with enough force to knock a picture frame off its hook. It hit the floor, and the glass cracked. She felt the plaster against her cheek, cold, rough. "You're under investigation for obstruction of a law enforcement proceeding," he said, close to her ear. "Anything you say?" "I know what I'm allowed to say." Her voice was even, flat, not the voice of someone panicking. "I also know you didn't bring a warrant in with you, so before you finish that sentence, you might want to check whether you're about to do something you can't walk back." He laughed, actually laughed. He cranked her arm higher and she felt the joint protest. "You've got some mouth for a nurse." He said it the way men like him say things they believe are true. Settled, permanent. "Let's go." The neighbors on Calloway Street had been jolted awake by the sound of the door. Mrs. Farrow from next door was already on her porch in a bathrobe. 2 doors down, the Delacroix family had their porch light on. A teenager with a phone had started recording from across the street, the flashlight beams from inside Olivia's house casting long shadows through the broken doorway. They watched Boone walk her out. She wasn't resisting. She wasn't crying. She was just walking, one arm twisted behind her back, looking at the dark street like she was reading something written on the asphalt. Then the SUVs arrived. Well, the first one came from the north end of Calloway, the second from the south. Black, no municipal plates, no light bars. They moved with the kind of deliberateness that wasn't police and wasn't civilian. The officers who'd followed Boone inside stopped moving. One of them stepped back toward the door and put his hand on his radio without keying it. Boone didn't stop walking. Not yet. The SUVs parked at opposite ends of the block, and the doors opened, and the men who got out weren't in uniform, not any uniform the Stonehaven Police Department would recognize. Dark tactical gear. No visible insignia except a single patch on the left shoulder that, if you knew what you were looking at, told you everything. One of them pulled out a phone, made a call that lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then he looked at Boone. "Release her." Boone blinked. "Excuse me?" "Release her." The man's voice didn't go up, didn't sharpen into a threat. He said it the way you'd read an instruction off a label. Now, officer. The two uniformed cops behind Boone had already taken a step back. The teenager across the street kept filming. Mrs. Farrow on her porch had gone completely still. Boone looked at Olivia. She looked back at him over her shoulder, and for the first time that morning, her expression shifted. Not triumph, not even satisfaction, something quieter and harder to name. "You have no idea who you just touched," she said. He let go of her arm. "What?" She'd come to Westbrook Medical Center 14 months ago. The hiring process had been unremarkable, which was by design. She'd moved to Stonehaven from a small city in western Pennsylvania, transferred her nursing license, submitted a resume that listed 6 years of ER experience and a bachelor's degree in nursing science, and a brief, vague note about previous government work that she'd specifically written to be easy to overlook. The department head, Dr. Philip Hart, had looked at her file for approximately 3 minutes before offering her the position. "Level 1 trauma experience?" he'd asked, scanning the page. "Yes." "Good. We need it. Night shifts okay?" "Preferred." That was the whole interview. She'd started the following Monday. She was good at the work. Not in the way that gets written up for hospital newsletters. She wasn't the type to pull off some cinematic save that everyone talks about for weeks. She was good in the way that actually matters. Fast hands, faster thinking, a composure under pressure that the other nurses noticed within the first month and couldn't quite account for. "Where'd you train?" Marcus Webb, one of the senior ER nurses, had asked her once during a slow hour. He was good too. 15 years in, unflappable, the kind of person you wanted on your side when things went sideways. Pittsburgh General, mostly. She was charting without looking up. And a few other places. What other places? She looked up then, smiled at him. Boring places. Nothing like this. He didn't press it, but he'd watched her after that. He wasn't the only one. The ER at Westbrook was a decent shop. Not the best funded, not the worst staffed. It handled Stonehaven's overflow, which meant gunshot wounds on weekend nights, industrial accidents from the Port District, the kind of polytrauma cases that separated the nurses who could manage from the nurses who could lead. Olivia led, quietly, without making a point of it. She'd suggest a different approach, and the suggestion was always right. She'd anticipate what a physician needed before they asked. She read a deteriorating patient the way a pilot reads instrument panels, constant, practiced, immediate. Dr. Hart noticed. He didn't always know what to do with what he noticed. There were other things she kept to herself. She ran 5 miles before every shift. She kept irregular hours on her days off, sometimes not returning home until well past midnight. She received, on occasion, phone calls that made her step out of whatever room she was in and stand in the parking lot for 10 minutes, speaking quietly, before coming back in with her expression reset to neutral. Nobody asked. She didn't invite asking. The trouble started 6 weeks before the raid. Yeesh what? A man named Terrence Gould had been brought into the ER on a Thursday evening, unconscious, no ID, multiple blunt force injuries to the head and torso. The paramedics who brought him in said they'd found him behind the Grayfield warehouse complex, 2 blocks off the port. Nobody claimed him. Nobody called. He spent 4 hours in the ER before being moved to the ICU, and during those 4 hours, Olivia had worked his case. She'd seen those injuries before, not in an ER. In a different context entirely, in a different country, with a different set of rules about what got written down and what didn't. She knew the difference between a man who'd been beaten by 3 people who were angry and a man who'd been beaten by 2 people who were methodical. She didn't say that out loud. But she did take photographs, clinical documentation, part of the chart. And she did notice, while cutting away his jacket, that the inner lining had a phone sewn into it, a burner, encrypted with a single contact saved under a letter. Not a name. A letter. She bagged it with his belongings, logged it, standard procedure. 3 hours later, a man came to the ER desk and asked about the patient, said he was a family friend, gave a name that Olivia, standing at the nurse's station, clocked immediately as false, the kind of false that has a particular texture to it, like a seam that doesn't quite match the fabric. She watched him. He never asked about Gould's condition. He asked about his belongings. She told the desk clerk to note the visitor. She sent a message to hospital security. And that night, at home, she made a call of her own. The man she called was not someone she'd spoken to in 11 months. "I need you to run something," she said, and gave him enough information to start. She didn't know that the request had been logged. She didn't know that someone at the Stonehaven PD, someone with access to a program they weren't supposed to be running, had been monitoring certain kinds of outbound communications from Westbrook Medical Center. She didn't know that the name she'd helped document in Gould's chart had flagged something on the wrong person's desk. What she did know, by the time Officer Boone came through her door, was that she'd gotten close enough to something to make someone nervous. What Boone didn't know was that getting nervous about Olivia Hayes and expressing that nervousness physically were, historically, two very different categories of mistake. They took her to the precinct, not in Boone's vehicle. After the men from the SUVs spoke to him for approximately 9 minutes in low voices on the sidewalk, the conversation visibly rearranging something in Boone's certainty, she was allowed to sit in the back of a standard patrol car. The two uniformed officers were quiet. She watched Stonehaven go by outside the window. The sky was starting to gray in the east, that particular shade of pre-dawn that isn't quite night anymore but hasn't committed to anything yet. Captain Renata Drummond was already at the precinct when they brought Olivia in. That told her something. You don't come in at 5 in the morning for a routine obstruction stop. Drummond was in her late 50s, squared shoulders, the face of someone who'd made it to the top of a hard institution by learning when to be visible and when to disappear. She was standing in the hallway outside the interview rooms, coffee in hand, watching Olivia come through the door. "Miss Hayes?" She didn't extend her hand. "I apologize for the manner of your—" "Save it!" Olivia sat down in the nearest chair without being told to. "What do you actually want?" Drummond looked at her for a moment, then sat down across from her. The two uniformed officers stationed themselves near the door. "We have some questions about your involvement with a patient admitted to Westbrook on the 14th, Terrence Gould. He was my patient. I documented his injuries, logged his belongings, notified security about a suspicious visitor. All of it's in the chart." "And the phone call you made that night?" Olivia met her eyes. "Which one?" A small pause. "The one at 11:42 p.m., 40-minute call, unregistered line." "I'm entitled to make personal calls." "Oh, from a burner?" She didn't answer that. She looked at the surface of the table for a moment, then back up. "I want to know what you're actually charging me with, or I'd like to leave." "You're not being charged with anything right now, Ms. Hayes. We're having a conversation." "Then I can leave." Drummond leaned forward slightly. Her voice dropped, not to friendliness, but to something more precise. "I'm trying to give you an opportunity here. The people who are interested in the Gould situation, they're not going to stop because you cooperate with us. But if you give us something, we can work with the hospital to—" "To what?" Olivia looked at her. "Suspend me quietly? Let this go away. It doesn't have to become a larger problem. It's already a larger problem. Your officer broke my front door." She stood up. "I'm leaving. If you decide to charge me with something, you can call my attorney." She walked to the door, and the two uniformed officers didn't stop her, because nobody told them to, and Drummond didn't move from her chair. Outside, the sky had moved from gray to pale pink. She stood on the precinct steps and made a call. When the person on the other end picked up, she said 4 words. "They know about Gould." There was a pause on the line, then, "How long?" "Long enough." Another pause. "Don't go back to the hospital today. I have a shift at 7. Olivia," his voice shifted, "don't go back today." She hung up. She looked at the street for a long moment. Then she went back to the hospital. The shift was already in motion when she arrived. Marcus was at the nurse's station, handing off a chart to the overnight charge nurse. He looked up when she came in, read something in her face immediately, and fell into step beside her. "You look like you've had a morning." "I have." "Anything I need to know?" "Probably not yet." She took her badge from her bag and clipped it on. "How's the board?" 4 in the back, 1 waiting on CT, 1 that's going to be a problem. He paused. "Administration got a call, by the way." She stopped walking. "About an hour ago. From someone at the police department." He kept his voice low. "I don't know what was said, but Hart's been in his office since." Dr. Philip Hart's relationship with difficulty was to manage it until it went away. She'd understood that about him early. He was a competent administrator and a decent physician, but he wore the opinions of authority figures the way some people wear clothes. You could always see them on him. He called her at 9:17. "Olivia, can you come up?" She knew what it was before she reached his door. His office was on the 4th floor, overlooking the hospital's east parking structure. He was standing at the window when she came in, which was either a habit or theater, and with heart she'd never been entirely sure which. "Close the door, please." She closed it. He turned around. He had the specific expression of a man about to say something he's convinced himself is reasonable. "I've received some concerns from the precinct and from several board members who were contacted this morning regarding your," he chose the word carefully, "involvement in an active police matter. I documented a patient's injuries and logged his belongings. That's not involvement, that's charting. The phone you found was logged as patient property. It's in the chart. There's also the matter of who you called after your shift." He picked up a pen, then put it down. "Olivia, I'm not accusing you of anything, but the optics here are Philip." She hadn't called him by his first name before. It stopped him. "Are you suspending me or not?" He picked up the pen again. "Pending a review, yes. Administrative leave with pay, effective today." Today. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded, once, uncrossed her arms, picked up her bag from where she'd set it against the chair. "Document this conversation," she said on her way out. "All of it. You're going to want to have it on record." He looked confused by that, which she'd expected. She left his office and rode the elevator down and walked back through the ER, past Marcus, who tracked her with his eyes the whole way but didn't ask. Past the nursing station where 2 of the day shift nurses exchanged a look she felt on the back of her neck. Past the ambulance bay and out into the morning. Her car was in the parking structure. She sat in it for 3 minutes without starting the engine. Then her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number, but she recognized the area code. She recognized it in the specific way you recognize something you've been half expecting in the back of your mind for weeks. She answered. "Hayes," she said. The voice on the other end said, "There's been an incident. Stonehaven Port District, coordinated. We're activating, and you're on the list. Do you understand what I'm saying?" She understood exactly what he was saying. Outside the parking structure, beyond the hospital's east wing, she could already hear the first sirens. Distant, then less distant. Then the sound that no urban noise map accounts for. The low rhythmic concussion of rotor blades cutting air, coming in fast from the north, more than one, flying in formation. She started the engine. The radio came on automatically, and the emergency broadcast was already running. "Multiple explosions reported near the Stonehaven Port District. Authorities are asking residents to..." She pulled out of the parking structure. By the time she reached the exit, she could see the smoke. 3 distinct columns, black and ugly against the morning sky, rising from the direction of the waterfront. And above them, banking hard in tight formation, 4 military helicopters that had no business being this close to a civilian hospital. Unless they were looking for something, unless they were looking for someone. Her phone rang again, different number. She put it on speaker. "Lieutenant Hayes." The voice was clipped, professional, carrying the specific weight of a rank she hadn't answered to in over a year. "We have a mass casualty event in progress. 80+ injured, infrastructure compromised, civilian medical assets overwhelmed. You are needed on site immediately. A vehicle is en route to your position." She turned left out of the hospital lot, toward the smoke. "Tell them I'm already moving," she said. Behind her, the helicopters descended toward the waterfront. And somewhere in the Stonehaven Police Department, in an office with blinds drawn against the morning, a man who had authorized a pre-dawn raid on a nurse's house was looking at his phone with an expression that had moved, in the last 40 minutes, from satisfaction to confusion to something closer to dread. He'd made a call. The call had not gone the way calls were supposed to go when you had the right people in the right places. He picked up his radio, put it down, picked it up again. Outside, the city was filling with sirens, and the black SUVs that had appeared on Calloway Street were moving again, not away from Stonehaven, but deeper into it, converging on a point that had nothing to do with a quiet nurse's house and everything to do with what she'd found in a patient's jacket lining 3 weeks ago. The smoke kept rising, and Lieutenant Olivia Hayes drove toward it. The smoke was thicker up close. Olivia had driven through Stonehaven enough times to know the Port District by feel.
the way the streets widened near the cargo terminals, the particular smell of salt and diesel that clung to everything within 6 blocks of the waterfront. She knew which roads flooded in heavy rain and which ones the city had quietly stopped maintaining. She knew the shortcut through the Grayfield Industrial Corridor that took 4 minutes off the route from Westbrook. She took it now, pushing her car hard through the empty early morning streets, the radio still broadcasting in the background, the voice on it growing more strained with each update. 2 explosions confirmed near Terminal 7. A third reported near the rail interchange at Dockside Avenue. Casualty numbers unknown, responders on scene, residents advised to stay indoors. She was not a resident staying indoors.
The first military checkpoint appeared at the corner of Brennan Street and Portside Loop. 2 soldiers in full tactical gear standing in the road with their hands up. Not aggressive, but absolute. She slowed, rolled her window down. "Lieutenant Hayes," she said before they could speak. She held up nothing. No badge, no ID. Because the man on the phone had said a vehicle was coming, and that meant her position was already known. "I was told to come in." The soldier on her left spoke into his radio, listened, nodded at his partner. "Follow Sergeant Voss." He gestured to a man behind him she hadn't seen, standing in the shadow of a concrete pillar. "He'll take you directly to the command point." She pulled forward. Voss jogged ahead of her car, which she found faintly absurd. She was driving, and he was running, and he was still keeping pace. And she followed him 2 blocks east and 1 block south until they reached what had been, 12 hours ago, a staging area for cargo containers, and was now something else entirely. The transformation was controlled chaos, which was the only kind of chaos the military tolerated. 4 vehicles she recognized as field medical units were positioned in a rough perimeter. Portable lighting had been deployed along the north edge of the lot, illuminating a triage area where bodies, some moving, some not, were already being brought in from the direction of Terminal 7. She counted 8 soldiers in medical gear and 4 in tactical. There were 2 men in civilian clothes who weren't civilian, the tell being the way they moved through the space, the way their eyes went to the perimeter first and the patients second. A man in his early 40s came toward her car before she'd fully stopped. Dark jacket, no visible rank, the kind of face that had seen enough to stop reacting to things. "Hayes? Colonel Marsh?" She got out of the car. She hadn't seen him in 14 months, but she knew his voice from the phone. "What are we dealing with?" 3 coordinated blasts, 40 minutes apart. IED construction, not improvised. Someone knew what they were doing. Terminal 7 took the worst of it. That's where the worker casualties are concentrated. Rail interchange had lighter density, but the infrastructure damage is going to complicate evacuation routes. He was already walking, and she was already beside him, both of them moving toward the triage perimeter. "Civilian hospitals are overwhelmed. Westbrook's ER went into mass casualty protocol 20 minutes ago." "I know. I was just suspended from Westbrook." He glanced at her sideways. "I heard. We'll deal with that later." "Who's your senior medical officer on site?" "Captain Raines. She's good, but she's never run a mass casualty response at this scale." "How many critical?" 14 confirmed. Probably more coming in from the terminal. He stopped walking and faced her. "I need someone who's done this before. In the actual conditions, not the simulation. You know what I'm asking." She knew. She'd done exactly this. Not here, not with civilians watching from behind police tape, but in places where the dust was different, and the language was different, and the rules about who you saved and in what order had been hers to write in the moment. "Show me the triage board," she said. Captain Raines was 29 and competent in the focused, careful way of someone who had learned exactly what she was taught and not yet been forced to improvise beyond it. She was standing over a man with blast injuries to the lower torso when Olivia arrived at the triage station, and she looked up with an expression that was equal parts relief and wariness. "Lieutenant Hayes," she said the rank like she'd been briefed on it. Colonel Marsh said, "Walk me through what you've got." Olivia was already looking at the board, then at the patients, cross-referencing. "Don't recap, just current status." Raines adapted quickly, which told Olivia something useful about her. 4 immediate, 8 delayed, 2 expectant. The 2 expectants are both blast lung. I don't have the equipment for what they need, and the hospital transfer routes are blocked. "Which routes?" Brennan Street has partial structural collapse from the second blast. Portside Loop is closed. The city shut it for emergency vehicles only, but they're not coordinating with us and the civilian ambulances are clogging it. Olivia looked at the two expectant patients. A man who appeared to be in his mid-50s, debris laceration across his scalp, the shallow, rapid breathing that said his lungs were fighting a battle they were losing. A younger woman, dock worker by her clothes, both hands pressed to her chest by a soldier kneeling beside her who was doing what he could, which wasn't enough. What's your blood supply? Limited? We have O-neg on hand, but I've been conservative with it because I didn't know how long. Stop being conservative. Olivia moved to the woman. She needs a chest decompression now. Do you have a 14 gauge? Yes. Then let's go. She didn't ask for gloves. She found them. She didn't ask who was assisting. She gestured, and two soldiers materialized at the correct positions because they'd been trained to read that gesture. She located the second intercostal space by feel and by the patient's breathing pattern, and the decompression needle went in with the particular resistance and release that she'd learned to recognize years ago in a forward surgical unit in a country she was not allowed to name. The woman's breathing changed. Not fixed, not yet, but it shifted from the ragged, compressed gasping of tension pneumothorax to something that had room to work with. She needs a chest tube, and she needs it at a real facility, Olivia said to Rains. Get me a clear route. The routes are get me a helicopter. Rains blinked. We have two birds, but they're allocated for reallocate. She moved to the 50-something man without stopping talking. One bird. This patient. Nearest level 1 trauma center. What's the closest? Harmon General, 12 miles north. That works. Make the call. Rains made the call. Olivia worked through the immediate list in the order of who would die soonest without intervention, which was the only order that mattered. The man with the scalp laceration had a subdural bleed she identified from the asymmetric pupil response. She stabilized him, tagged him for priority transfer, moved to the next. A teenager, which meant someone's child had been at the port at 6 in the morning, and nobody was going to explain that adequately later. With a crushed left forearm and the particular gray pallor of blood pressure too low for too long. She got 2 large-bore IVs established, called for fluid, watched color come back into his face in increments. Behind her, she heard it. The murmur. The kind that moves through a group of people who have just realized something. She didn't turn around. She kept her hands on the patient. Derek Boone had been at the command point for approximately 6 minutes before anyone told him why the military was running the site instead of the department. He'd come with Captain Drummond because Drummond had gotten a call and pulled him out of the precinct with an expression on her face he'd been reading for 4 years. That expression meant something had gone sideways. The scale of sideways was variable. He'd assumed, driving over, that it was about the raid. The men in the black SUVs, the phone call that had pulled them back to wherever they came from, the way everyone at the precinct this morning had been speaking in carefully reduced tones. He hadn't expected her. He saw her at the triage station first from a distance of maybe 40 feet, working over a patient with the kind of focused efficiency that didn't leave room for anything else. She was in her street clothes, no white coat, no ID visible. The soldiers around her weren't directing her, they were assisting her. He stood there for a moment, working it out. She's running the medical operation? He said it to Drummond quietly. Drummond didn't answer because Colonel Marsh was already walking toward them from the command vehicle. Captain Drummond? He didn't acknowledge Boone except to look at him the way you look at furniture you weren't expecting to be there. I need to be direct with you about the situation. Please. Drummond's voice was careful. We have jurisdiction here. This is a civilian. You had jurisdiction. As of 45 minutes ago, this site is under federal emergency authority. Your officers are welcome to assist with perimeter control and civilian evacuation. He paused. That's the offer. What exactly is the federal interest in? Lieutenant Hayes. He said her name without warmth or theater, just precision. The woman your department arrested this morning and your hospital suspended this morning is currently the senior medical officer of this response. She is here under active federal orders. What happened to her today, the manner of it, the timing of it, is now part of an active federal investigation. Boone felt something shift in his chest. Not guilt. He wasn't built for immediate guilt. It was more structural than that. The feeling of standing on something you thought was solid and discovering it has a different composition than you assumed. Drummond kept her voice even, which Boone respected even now. The investigation pertains to what, specifically? I'm not at liberty to discuss that with you. Marsh looked at Boone directly for the first time. Officer Boone, the individuals who authorized your actions this morning are going to want to be very careful about the next 48 hours. Boone said nothing. Marsh went back to the command vehicle. Drummond turned and looked at Boone with an expression that had stripped out all the careful management she usually wore. Underneath it was something simpler and colder. Who told you to go to her house? She said. You know who? I want to hear you say it. He didn't say it. And the fact that he didn't say it told her enough. Emily's. Marcus Webb arrived at the port staging area at 7:43, which was 30 minutes after Westbrook's mass casualty protocol had completely saturated the ER's capacity, and Dr. Hart had authorized 3 of his senior nurses to respond to the federal medical request. Marcus had volunteered before Hart finished the sentence. He found Olivia at what had become the central coordination point of the triage area, standing over a field table with a handwritten status board that she'd organized in the 20 minutes since arriving. It wasn't military formatted. It was something between military and ER protocol, adapted on the fly to the specific conditions of this site, and when Marcus looked at it, he understood it immediately because it was structured like her mind. You look like you haven't slept, he said. I slept from 2 to 4. She handed him a list without looking up. I need someone to run secondary triage at the rail site. There are still people being extracted from the interchange. Rains can go with you. What happened to your arm? She glanced at her left forearm, which had a bruise developing from the wall this morning, the wall Boone had put her into. Nothing. He looked at her for a moment. Olivia. Marcus. She looked up. I need the secondary triage covered. He took the list. When this is done, you're going to explain all of this to me. Some of it. He left with Rains and she went back to the board. By 8:15, the immediate list had been reduced by half. 3 patients had been successfully transferred by helicopter, 2 of them the expectant cases from earlier who were now, apparently, alive enough to be someone else's problem, which was the best outcome available. The teenager with the crushed arm had stabilized. The man with the subdural had been intubated in the field by a military physician who'd arrived with the second wave of support assets, a process Olivia had supervised without touching because the physician was capable and she had 4 other patients who needed her more. It was during the intubation that she looked up and saw Derek Boone watching her from the edge of the triage perimeter. He was 30 feet away. He wasn't in uniform anymore. He'd taken off his jacket, which was a choice that struck her as odd until she realized it was the jacket, with the badge and rank insignia. He was just a large man in a blue shirt standing at the edge of a disaster site, watching a woman he'd thrown against a wall 3 hours ago direct military medical personnel through the worst mass casualty event Stonehaven had seen in 20 years. She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then she turned back to her work. She didn't have the space in the current moment to think about what his face looked like during those 2 seconds. Later, she would remember it as the expression of a man revising something fundamental. But in the moment, she had a board to clear and patients to move, and the secondary triage report from Marcus coming in through her earpiece in the clipped efficient shorthand that she'd taught him without meaning to, over 14 months of night shifts. 7 more at the interchange, Marcus said through the radio. 2 criticals, 4 walking wounded, 1 I can't categorize yet. Rains is good, by the way. I know. What's the one you can't categorize? Blast injury, right side, inconsistent presentation. He's conscious and he's lying about his pain level. She processed that for a moment. Photograph the injury pattern. Send it to me. The photo came through 40 seconds later. She looked at it while walking between patients, and what she saw stopped her mid-step. The injury pattern was consistent with primary blast injury, but there was additional trauma, blunt force, targeted, older than today's explosions by at least several hours. This man had been hurt before the blast. He'd been at the port before the blast. Marcus. She kept her voice even. Don't let that patient leave the site. Whatever you have to say to keep him there, say it. What is he? She looked at the photograph again. I don't know yet, she said, but I think he might be the reason any of this happened. She looked up from her phone and found Colonel Marsh 12 feet away, his eyes already on her, because he'd been watching her since the photograph came through, and he had his own read on what it meant. We need to talk, he said. Yes, she said. We do. Behind them, at the edge of the triage perimeter, a federal agent she hadn't noticed until now was on his phone, not speaking, listening. The call had come in while Olivia was looking at the photograph. The caller was someone inside the Stonehaven Police Department. The agent listened for 16 seconds, then hung up, then looked at his partner. His partner looked back at him. Drummond? The partner said. The first agent shook his head. Higher, he said. The two agents moved without appearing to hurry, which was its own kind of speed. Olivia watched them cross the staging area toward the command vehicle, their path deliberate, angled away from the triage perimeter where Boone was still standing in his blue shirt looking like a man who'd just realized he was in the wrong building. She filed that away and turned to Marsh. The patient at the interchange, she said, the one with the inconsistent presentation. His injury pattern has 2 timelines. Marsh looked at the photograph she held out. He studied it for 4 seconds, which for him was a long time. Pre-blast trauma. At least 6 hours old, maybe more. He was at the port before any of this happened, and whatever he was doing there, someone put hands on him first. She put the phone away. That's not a coincidence. No, Marsh said. It's not. He looked toward the interchange site, then back at her. Finish the triage. I'll handle the patient. I want to talk to him. You will. He said it like a fact rather than a concession. Finish the triage first. We need the medical situation contained before we open the other door. She didn't argue because he was right about the sequencing and they both knew it. She went back to the board. The next 40 minutes were the kind of work that doesn't look like anything from the outside. Moving between patients, adjusting treatment priorities as conditions shifted, redirecting personnel with the minimal language of someone who'd learned long ago that in a mass casualty environment, every extra word is a second someone doesn't have. She knew when to delegate and when not to. She knew the difference between a medic who needed supervision and one who needed to be left alone to do the thing they were already doing correctly. Captain Raines came back from the interchange at 9:03 with Marcus behind her, and something changed in her face. The patient, Olivia said. He's stable. He's also... He wanted to talk before Colonel Marsh got to him. Raines hesitated. He asked for you specifically. That was new information. By name. By name, she looked at Marcus. He shrugged, but it wasn't the shrug of someone who didn't know. It was the shrug of someone who knew something uncomfortable and was deciding how much to carry. What did he say to you? She asked him directly. Marcus glanced at Raines, then back. He said he knew Terrence Gould. Said they were both supposed to be at the port last night. Then he said your name and asked if you were really here. She was already moving. The patient's name, she found out later, was Alan Price. He was 44 years old, a freight logistics coordinator who had been working the Stonehaven port for 11 years, and he was the reason 3 blocks of the waterfront had been detonated at coordinated intervals on a Tuesday morning. Not because he'd planned it, because he'd tried to stop it. He was sitting up on a field cot at the interchange triage point, his right side wrapped, his face the particular color of someone who'd lost a meaningful amount of blood and then been stabilized but hadn't had time to process either event. He watched her cross the space toward him with the eyes of a man who'd been waiting for a specific person and couldn't quite believe they'd actually arrived. Lieutenant Hayes, he said, don't call me that here. She sat on the edge of the cot beside him, not across from him in the way that creates a clinical distance, beside him. Talk to me. He talked. It came out in the uneven way that shock-adjacent revelations always come out. Not chronological, not organized, jumping between the most urgent facts and the most frightening ones without a clear through line. She let him go and listened and sorted it as he spoke, the way she'd learned to sort information in environments where the person delivering it was either injured or terrified, or both. Price had been approached 8 months ago by a man he knew through the Port Authority. A man who, it turned out, had connections to a network that was using the Stonehaven freight system to move things that weren't documented on any manifest. He hadn't understood the scope of it immediately. By the time he did, he'd already seen enough to make him dangerous, and the people he'd seen it with had communicated that fact clearly, with the 6 hours of prior trauma currently wrapped in field dressings on his right side. Terrence Gould had been his contact, the person Price had been trying to reach when Gould ended up unconscious behind the Grayfield warehouse with his burner phone sewn into his jacket lining. "Someone told them about Gould," Price said. His voice was hoarse. "After he ended up at your hospital, someone told them he'd been found." "Who told them?" He looked at her steadily. "Someone inside the department." She didn't react visibly. "The explosions this morning were supposed to happen last night. The timetable moved up when—" He stopped, swallowed. "When they found out Gould had survived, they needed to destroy the cargo documentation before it could be pulled. Terminal 7 holds 18 months of fraudulent manifests. The interchange was secondary. Disruption coverage." "How many people knew the exact timetable?" "4, maybe 5. He looked down at his wrapped side. "I was supposed to be dead before the first one went off." She sat with that for a moment. "Alan," she kept her voice level, "the man who authorized the raid on my house this morning, did you know about that?" He looked back up, and what she read in his face was not surprise but something heavier, something that had been sitting on him for a while. "The raid was to get the phone," he said. "Gould's phone. The contact list on it. It was logged as patient property. They thought you'd taken it home. Someone told Boone you'd—" He stopped again. "Someone gave Boone bad information, or gave him exactly the information they wanted him to act on." She heard Marcia's footsteps before she saw him, the particular cadence of someone who had covered a lot of ground in a short time. "I need 5 more minutes," she said without turning. "You have 3, Marsh said. He positioned himself just outside earshot of Price, which was professional courtesy and also a form of pressure. She turned back to Price. "The person inside the department. You have a name?" He gave her one. It wasn't Boone. The name sat in her chest like a weight with edges as she walked back to Marsh and repeated it to him quietly, and she watched his face do the thing faces do when information arrives that confirms a pattern rather than revealing a new one. Not surprise. Something more tired. "We had him as a person of interest 2 months ago," Marsh said. "We couldn't move on it without the cargo documentation, which is currently on fire. The physical documentation, the digital records are a different situation." He looked toward the smoke, which had thinned from black to gray, the fires at Terminal 7 having been reached by the fire department in the last hour. "There are backup systems. The network kept records it wasn't supposed to keep. Then you already have what you need." "We have what we need to build a case. Having it and being able to use it legally are different things, and the pathway from one to the other involves some procedural steps that are," he paused, "sensitive, given who the name is attached to." She understood what he wasn't saying. When the person implicated had a certain level of institutional access, the case had to be assembled with a specificity that left no room for procedural challenge. One wrong step and the whole architecture collapses. "How long?" she asked. "Not long now." He looked at her directly. "The raid this morning accelerated things. Whoever authorized that, they miscalculated badly." She nodded once. Went back to the triage board. She worked for another hour and 40 minutes, not because she was avoiding the other thing, but because there were still patients, and she was still the most qualified person on site to manage them, and that fact didn't change based on what else was happening on the edges of her awareness. The teenager with the crushed arm had been transferred successfully. The woman with the chest decompression had made it to Harmon General and was in surgery. The man with the subdural bleed was in the ICU at a facility 40 minutes north, status unknown, but alive. She held each of those facts like benchmarks, the way you hold landmarks when you're navigating difficult terrain. At 10:17, Marcus found her at the secondary triage station. He didn't say anything for a moment, just handed her a cup of coffee from somewhere that she didn't ask about because it was hot and she needed it. "I heard the name," he said finally. She looked at him. Price wasn't quiet about it, Marcus said. I was close enough. She drank the coffee. It was bad. She drank it anyway. Deputy Commissioner Aldrich Voss, he said it carefully, the way you say the name of something you're not sure is safe to hold. Don't repeat that again until you're asked to, she said. Not here, not anywhere. Olivia. He waited until she looked at him. He was at Westbrook 2 weeks ago. Hart had a meeting with him. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but he was there and he asked about... Marcus stopped. Asked about what? He asked about you. Specifically, I overheard Hart's assistant talking about it after, said the deputy commissioner had requested a review of your employment file. She kept her expression still, but something moved behind it. The timeline was rearranging itself into a shape that was cleaner and more deliberate than she'd understood this morning. How long before the raid was this? 8 days. 8 days. Voss had looked at her file. Then Boone had come through her door. The gap between those two events wasn't coincidence and wasn't sloppiness. It was a decision that someone had made with enough confidence to think it would work. What they hadn't accounted for was Gould surviving. What they hadn't accounted for was a phone that had already been documented in a hospital chart, logged in a system with a timestamp, photographed and filed before anyone from the network had a chance to pull it. And what they catastrophically had not accounted for was what happened when you sent an aggressive officer to do a quiet job and he was too rough about it, and the woman he was rough with had a federal protection designation that nobody in the department had thought to check. She finished the coffee. When this is done, she said to Marcus, I need you to write down everything you remember about that meeting. Time, date, what you heard, who was present. Don't discuss it with anyone else. He nodded. Across the staging area, she could see the 2 federal agents from earlier now standing with Marsh, and the body language of the 3 of them had changed from earlier in the morning. The conversation had a different quality. Less information sharing, more coordination. They were moving to the next phase. Her phone rang. She looked at the number, recognized the prefix. She stepped away from the triage station and answered. Hayes? We're moving on Voss in the next 2 hours. The voice belonged to a woman she'd never met in person, a federal prosecutor whose name she'd been given 3 weeks ago by the same man who'd told her to make the 1142 call. I need you at the site for a formal statement. Your testimony on the Gould documentation is central to the chain of evidence. I'm at the port site, mass casualty response. I know where you are. Can you be ready to leave in 90 minutes? She looked around the staging area. 14 patients remaining on the board, 8 of them stable enough for standard transfer. Raines was capable. Marcus was there. Yes, she said. She hung up and went to find Raines. The conference room at the federal field office on Kellner Avenue was not built for comfort, which was fine. It had a table, chairs, a screen on one wall, and 4 people who were there for the same reason she was. To build something airtight out of a morning that had started with a door coming off its hinges and moved through a mass casualty event and was now arriving at its actual point. The prosecutor's name was Sandra Kwan. She was in her late 40s, precise in the way of someone who had learned that precision was the only protection against systems that didn't want to be held accountable. She asked her questions in order, and Olivia answered them in order. And between them, they assembled a factual chronology of everything from Gould's admission to the logging of the phone to the 1142 call to the raid to the staging area that morning. It took 2 hours and 11 minutes. When it was done, Kwan put down her pen and looked at her. I want you to understand something about what you did when you logged that phone, she said. By putting it in the chart with a timestamp, you created a documented record that predates anything Voss or Boone or anyone connected to them could touch. They couldn't pull it. They couldn't alter it. The only thing they could do was try to discredit the person who filed it. She paused. That's why the raid happened the way it did. The noise, the neighbors, the public humiliation. They wanted a narrative about a problematic employee before anyone started asking questions about the documentation. Olivia had understood this, in abstract, for most of the morning. Hearing it said plainly by someone with Kwan's forensic specificity made it land differently. It didn't work, she said. It didn't work, Kwan agreed, partly because of your prior designation, which they apparently failed to check, and partly because they moved too fast and too loud, and that created witnesses. The neighbor across the street. Had the video uploaded to 3 platforms before 6 a.m.? Kwan allowed herself a brief, dry expression that wasn't quite a smile. The footage has been viewed 2.4 million times as of an hour ago. Olivia absorbed that. What's the timeline on Voss? Kwan looked at the clock on the wall. The arrest warrant was signed 40 minutes ago. He's being taken into custody at his office right now. She looked back at Olivia. Boone's warrant was signed 30 minutes ago. The room held that for a moment. Then Olivia's phone buzzed, a message from a number she recognized as Marcus's work cell. Channel 7 has cameras outside the precinct. Something's happening. She looked up at Kwan. Is there a television in this building? The conference room had no television, but the hallway outside it had a monitor mounted on the wall that was currently showing the local news feed on mute, and the image on it was the exterior of the Stonehaven Police Department's main precinct building, where 2 federal vehicles were parked at angles that communicated non-negotiability. A small group of people had gathered in the hallway to watch. Olivia stood at the back. The camera caught it live. Boone coming out of the building's main entrance, wrists in front of him, an agent on each arm. He was in his civilian clothes still, the blue shirt from the port sight, and he moved with the stiff deliberateness of a man refusing to let his legs show what his legs felt. Behind him, in a different suit, the one she didn't recognize from earlier but could identify from context, was the man who had coordinated her suspension with a phone call before 7 in the morning. Then the second set of doors. Deputy Commissioner Aldrich Voss was a tall man who had the bearing of someone who had spent 30 years being important in rooms. He carried it even now. Head up, shoulders back, the practiced neutrality of a face that had learned to reveal nothing in public. He came through the doors in a gray suit and a loosened tie, with 2 agents flanking him and a third behind, and the reporters outside the precinct surged forward in the way reporters do, and the cameras caught everything. Someone in the hallway behind Olivia said something she didn't fully process. Another person pulled out a phone. She watched Voss reach the vehicle. Watched the agent's hand go to his head in the automatic protective gesture. Watched him fold into the back seat. She looked at the monitor for another moment. Then she took out her phone and called Colonel Marsh. He answered on the second ring. I saw it, he said. Price, she said. He needs formal protection before anyone realizes how much he told us. Already handled. He's been moved. She let out a slow breath. And Gould? There was a pause. Gould is awake, Marsh said. He's been awake since this morning. We've had someone with him since he opened his eyes, but we needed the arrest to proceed before... Another pause, shorter. He wants to talk to you. To me specifically? You're apparently the reason he made it to a hospital at all. He knows what you did with the phone. She leaned against the wall in the hallway, looking at the monitor where the news was now cutting between the exterior of the precinct and an aerial shot of the Port District, smoke still visible from Terminal 7, the military vehicles still visible at the staging area. When? She asked. Tomorrow morning. His doctors want him to rest tonight. That's fine. She looked down at her hands. They were clean. She'd scrubbed at the federal building. But her left forearm still had the bruise from the wall, now fully developed to the yellowed edges of something that was going to look worse before it looked better. Marsh. Yeah. The suspension, Hart, is already on the phone with his board, Marsh said. We sent them the relevant documentation an hour ago. You'll have a call from Westbrook by tonight. She should have felt something cleaner than what she felt. She felt tired. She felt the particular tiredness of a day that had started at 4 in the morning and had moved through more categories of experience than a single day had a right to contain. I need to sleep, she said. I know. He sounded briefly like a person instead of a rank. Hayes, you did good work today. 14 patients made it off that board alive who might not have. That's what I said. She pushed off the wall. The monitor behind her showed the news helicopter circling Terminal 7, the smoke thinning out now, the city's waterfront looking like the aftermath of something rather than the thing itself. Below the aerial shot, a text ticker ran with early casualty numbers. 31 treated, 6 critical,
0 confirmed fatalities. 0. She walked toward the elevator. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a number she didn't recognize, and she almost didn't answer it, except that she'd been answering unknown numbers all day because that was what today had required. She answered, silence on the other end, then breathing, then a voice she didn't know saying 4 words in a tone that made her stop walking immediately. "They have Marcus Webb." She didn't ask who was calling. "Where?" she said. The voice on the other end was male, controlled, the kind of controlled that comes from training rather than calm. "Westbrook Medical Center, loading dock, east side. They're saying it's a mugging, but it happened 4 minutes ago, and the responding officer isn't calling it in." "Who are you?" A pause. "Someone who's been watching the wrong people for the right reasons. Don't come alone." The line went dead. She was already moving back down the hallway toward the conference room, toward Quan, who was still at the table gathering her documentation with the methodical efficiency of someone who believed the day was winding down. "I need a vehicle, and I need someone with authority to make a phone call in the next 60 seconds, Olivia said from the doorway. Quan looked up.
Read her face, put down the papers. Talk, booked. The federal vehicle made it to Westbrook in 11 minutes. Olivia was in the passenger seat, and the driver was an agent named Delaney who hadn't asked questions, because Quan had told him not to ask questions, and he'd taken that instruction the way competent people take instructions they understand are time-sensitive. She'd called Marsh from the car. He'd called someone else. By the time they reached the hospital's east side, 2 more vehicles were already there. Not police, not ambulance. The same configuration of dark and unmarked that had appeared on Callaway Street before dawn. The loading dock at Westbrook's east wing was a utilitarian space. Concrete ramp, steel roll-up doors, the kind of area that exists in every hospital and that nobody thinks about except the people who use it. At the base of the ramp, there was a figure on the ground. She was out of the vehicle before it fully stopped. Marcus was conscious, which was the first thing she confirmed. He was sitting with his back against the concrete base of the loading dock wall, one hand pressed to the side of his head, the other flat on the ground beside him in the involuntary way of someone whose body is doing its own stabilizing work. His left eye was swollen to a slit. There was blood from a cut above his ear that had run down his neck and soaked into the collar of his shirt. She was on her knees in front of him before she registered kneeling. Marcus. She moved his hand away from his head. The cut was deep enough to need closure, but not arterial. The bleeding was slowing. "How long have you been down?" "Maybe 10 minutes." His voice was thick. "I'm okay." "You're not okay." She did a rapid neurocheck, pupil response, tracking, grip strength on both sides. Left grip was slightly diminished. "Any loss of consciousness?" "For maybe a minute. I came back." She looked at his pupils again. Not blown, not fixed. Reactive, asymmetric by a small margin that she didn't like but wasn't in the catastrophic range. Concussion, definite. Possible mild intracranial involvement. He needed a CT. "There were 2 of them," he said. "I was coming back from—" He stopped, winced when she pressed along the orbital rim. "I was coming back from talking to Hart. He called me in after you left. I think someone was watching the building." "What did Hart want?" "He wanted to know what I'd told the federal people. Said he'd gotten a call. Not from Marsh's side, from someone else. Wanted to know if I'd mentioned the meeting with Voss." "And you said?" "I said I'd mentioned it." He looked at her with his one workable eye. 30 seconds later, my phone rang. I went outside to answer it. Nobody was there. Then there were 2 people who were very much there. She sat back on her heels and looked at him for a moment. Not clinically, but as herself, with the weight of a day that had already taken more than it should have. "You're going to tell me I should have waited," he said. "You didn't know." "I should have." "Marcus." She put her hand briefly on his shoulder. "You didn't know. Let's get you inside." She stood up and turned to Delaney. "I need him in the ER. CT of the head, neuroconsult, full trauma workup. He's a Westbrook employee. They know him." "Got it." Delaney was already on his radio. Behind her, one of the agents from the other vehicles was crouched near the base of the ramp, looking at something on the concrete. He pulled out his phone and photographed it. She looked over his shoulder. A broken phone, shattered, the pieces arranged by impact in a rough scatter pattern. Marcus's phone, she guessed, smashed deliberately so whatever was on it couldn't be accessed. Too late for that. Whatever Marcus had said to Kwan's team was already documented and would remain so regardless of what happened to a phone. But the fact that someone had sent two people to a hospital loading dock to beat a nurse and destroy his phone told her something specific. The network wasn't fully contained. Voss and Boone were in custody. The arrest warrants were executed. But someone was still operational, still making decisions, still issuing instructions. She looked at the broken phone on the concrete. Someone had known Marcus was at Westbrook. Someone had known he'd spoken to the federal team. Someone was inside the information loop in a way that the arrest this morning had not disrupted. She went to find Kwan, Utitit. Kwan took 7 minutes to arrive, during which time Olivia stood in the Westbrook ER and watched the staff she'd worked alongside for 14 months run a trauma workup on a man she'd spent 14 months working alongside and felt the particular wrongness of being on the wrong side of the gurney. She'd asked to stay out of it. She was too close and she knew it, and the residents running the case didn't need her leaning over their shoulders. She stood by the wall and let them work. Dr. Hart appeared in the corridor at some point during the workup. He stopped when he saw her, and for a moment his face did something complicated. Not guilt, exactly, but something adjacent to it, the expression of a man trying to calculate how much he should say in a public space. She made it easier for him by speaking first. "Who called you after I left the federal building?" He looked down the corridor, then back at her. "I don't think I should—" "Philip." She kept her voice flat. "Marcus is in there with a concussion and a head lack because someone knew he'd been talking to the federal prosecutors. And the only way someone knew that is because someone in a position of access passed that information. I'm asking you who called you." He was quiet for long enough that she almost pushed again. Then, "It came through the board chair's office. Someone representing— They said they were representing certain department interests. They asked whether any hospital staff had provided statements related to a police internal matter. And you told them Marcus had." He didn't answer. "Did you tell them he'd just left the building?" "I didn't know." He stopped, started again. "I didn't understand what it was connected to. I thought it was a routine administrative—" "It wasn't." She looked at him steadily. "You need to tell Kwan's team exactly what was said and exactly who made the call. Every word. Tonight." He nodded. He looked like a man whose understanding of the day had just reorganized itself into something much larger than he'd been managing, and the weight of it was landing on him in real time. She left him in the corridor. Kwan arrived with a second prosecutor and a federal agent she hadn't seen before, which told Olivia that the scale of the response was still expanding. They took a room the hospital cleared for them, a small conference room on the second floor, the kind used for family meetings. And Kwan sat across from Olivia and put a recorder on the table. "The attack on Webb," Kwan said. "Tell me everything from the phone call." She told it, all of it, in order, including the anonymous caller whose voice she couldn't identify, the 11-minute drive, the state she'd found Marcus in, and what Marcus had told her about Hart's summons, and the phone call that had preceded the attack. "Someone inside your information chain is still active," Olivia said when she'd finished. "We know." Kwan's expression was the specific flatness of someone managing controlled frustration. The Voss arrest triggered a fail-safe. There are people in peripheral positions who are insulated from the main network architecture. They don't know enough to be charged, but they know enough to be dangerous. Hart's board chair. "Lenora Fitch," Kwan said the name like it had already been on her list. "She's not in the network, and she's a useful contact. Someone who could make calls that wouldn't be traced to the primary operation. She received a payment 18 months ago that we've been trying to connect. The Voss arrest gives us the predicate. Can you move on her tonight?" "We need one more piece before we can." Kwan looked at her. "The cargo network used a secondary communication channel, not the main encrypted system that went down with the terminal documentation. A backup. We have evidence it exists, but we haven't been able to access the architecture." "Where is it?" "That's the problem." Kwan paused. The backup channel was hosted through a server that routes through Westbrook's internal network. Someone inside the hospital installed it 14 months ago. 14 months ago. Olivia looked at the recorder on the table. "Before I arrived," she said. 3 weeks before." She thought about that. Thought about the specificity of it. Someone who needed an institutional anchor for a secondary communication channel, who'd chosen a hospital network because hospital networks were complex and patchwork and rarely had the security infrastructure of a corporate or government system, and who had done it 3 weeks before she arrived, which meant it wasn't connected to her, but it was connected to this building, and this building was the site where Gould had been brought, and where his phone had been logged, and where the chain of events that had eventually led to today had formally begun. "You need access to the server," she said. "We need the exact location. Hospital IT won't cooperate without a specific warrant, and the warrant requires us to identify which server." Olivia was quiet for a moment. "Marcus," she said, "he's been at Westbrook for 15 years. He knows every infrastructure change, every equipment installation, every renovation." She stood up. "When he was stable, I need 10 minutes with him." Quan glanced at the second prosecutor, then back. "When he's stable." The CT showed a mild concussion, no intracranial bleed, which was the difference between a terrible night and a catastrophic one. Marcus was in a room by 8:30, upright, refusing to lie flat the way people with concussions often refuse to lie flat, because being upright felt more in control even though it wasn't. He had a proper head dressing now, and an ice pack he kept forgetting to hold against his eye. Olivia sat in the chair beside his bed. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Ask." 14 months ago, 3 weeks before I started. Was there any IT work done? Infrastructure installation, server equipment, anything that came through outside the normal channels? He looked at the ceiling for a moment. The working eye did most of the work. There was something in the sub-basement. I remember it because they did it over a weekend, and the HVAC in the East Wing went down because they cut the wrong line. I had to move 2 patients. Do you know what they installed? I know it wasn't on the approved capital list. I made a comment about it to the facilities manager at the time. He said it was a data routing update, authorized from the board level. From the board chair's office? Marcus looked at her. I never verified that. I had 2 displaced patients and a broken HVAC. I let it go. She stood up. Sub-basement, East Wing. There's a server room down there. Was already there. But there's a secondary alcove. They framed it in during that weekend. I remember because the new drywall didn't match. She put her hand on his arm briefly. Rest. Olivia. He caught her wrist. Not hard, just enough. Be careful what you do with whatever's down there. I'm not doing anything with it. I'm telling Quan's team where to look. He let go. They should move fast. If someone's still active and they know the arrests happened, they might try to wipe it. She was already at the door. I know. Nice. She found Quan in the corridor and gave her the location in 30 seconds. Quan made 2 calls in the next 4 minutes. 12 minutes after that, a federal technical team was in the Westbrook sub-basement with a warrant that had been expedited through a judge who had been on standby since the morning arrests. Olivia wasn't allowed into the sub-basement. She stood in the corridor outside the stairwell door and waited, which was its own kind of difficult. The waiting after you've handed something off, when the thing is out of your hands and you have nothing to do but let the process run. The day had been going for 16 hours. She sat down on a bench outside the radiology department, which was quiet at this hour, and looked at the wall opposite, which had a piece of art on it, something generic and soft, the kind of art that hospitals put in corridors to make the space feel less like what it is. She'd walked past it 1,000 times without looking at it. She looked at it now. She was still looking at it when Delaney came down the corridor at a half jog, which was fast for him, and stopped in front of her with an expression that had moved out of control and into something more unguarded. They found it, he said. The server's intact, all of it. 18 months of secondary communications, encrypted but recoverable. Names, dates, transaction records, the whole secondary network. She held the information for a moment. Fitch, she said. 47 documented communications between her office and 3 network principals, including a message sent 2 hours ago, after the Voss arrest. She was trying to trigger the wipe protocol on the server, and it didn't work because your team was already inside the network. She looked back at the art on the wall. Quan's moving on her now, Delaney said. Good. He sat down on the other end of the bench, which was not something she'd expected. He was silent for a moment. You should know, he said, the footage from this morning, the video the neighbor took, It's been running on every major news platform all day. Someone in the Federal Communications Office made a statement about your designation. Not details, just enough. He paused. People know what they did to you this morning. She didn't respond to that. The hospital. Hart's already sent a formal communication to his board, reinstating you pending review of the review that shouldn't have happened. He almost smiled at the absurdity of the phrasing. Official letter tomorrow morning. She was quiet for a long time. I have 37 patients I need to follow up on, she said finally. From this morning's response, I need to know where they were transferred and what their current status is. Delaney looked at her. That's your response to all of this? She looked at him. What else would I do? He didn't have an answer for that. He stood up, gave her a small nod, and went back down the corridor. She sat alone on the bench for another few minutes. Her left arm ached where the bruise had settled in. Her feet hurt. She'd been awake for, she counted backwards, 21 hours, and the last time she'd eaten anything was at 2 a.m, half a bowl of cereal at the kitchen table before the battering ram came through the door. She pulled out her phone and started pulling up the transfer records for the morning's patients. She was 3 names into the list when her phone rang with a number she'd never seen before, but the prefix was one she recognized from a different context entirely. One that meant this call was being routed through a specific channel and was therefore not a random contact. She answered. The voice was male, older, measured, not a voice she knew. Lieutenant Hayes, my name is Hargrove. I'm the Federal District Coordinator for the Stonehaven investigation. A pause. I want you to know that everything that happened today, the arrest warrants, the server seizure, the testimony documentation, is holding. The network is in custody or under active pursuit. You should feel secure. I do, she said. Is there something specific you need? Another pause, slightly longer. We have a situation we didn't anticipate. One of the individuals brought in for questioning this afternoon, not Voss, not Boone, someone in the peripheral tier, made a statement about 90 minutes ago. We verified it in the last hour. She waited. There's a 5th individual, not in the original organizational structure we mapped. Someone who inserted themselves into the network approximately 4 months ago, operating as a secondary controller. Someone with access to the hospital's administrative layer who was using that position to monitor communications and redirect information. She stood up from the bench. This individual, Hargrove continued, was the one who passed Marcus Webb's location to the people who attacked him tonight. Was the one who fielded the call to Hart about his statement. Was the one who tried to trigger the server wipe 2 hours ago. You have a name. We have a name, Hargrove said, and we have a location. The individual is currently inside Westbrook Medical Center. She turned and looked down the empty corridor, at the art on the wall, at the fluorescent light, at the closed doors and the quiet that wasn't actually quiet if you listened for the right things. Which department? She said. Hargrove told her. She already knew the name before he said it because when she thought back, not to today, but to the weeks before today, to the patterns that hadn't looked like patterns at the time, there was one thread she hadn't pulled on because it had seemed too peripheral, too administrative, too far from the medical core of what she was doing to matter. She'd been wrong about that. He's still in the building? She said. His keycard was used 11 minutes ago. He's aware the server was seized. We believe he's trying to reach a secondary backup that his colleagues don't know about. In the hospital. In the hospital, Hargrove confirmed. We have people moving, but the building is large and he knows it better than our agents do. She was already walking. I know it better than he does, she said. The sub-basement had 2 access points most people knew about and one that appeared on no current floor plan because it had been sealed in a renovation 6 years ago and then quietly unsealed by someone who needed it and didn't want that need documented. She knew about it because Marcus had shown it to her once during a late-night shift when they'd been tracking down a patient record that had been misfiled in a decommissioned storage area. She took the stairs at the end of the radiology corridor, 2 at a time. The sub-basement smelled of concrete dust and recycled air and the faint chemical undertone of hospital infrastructure that never fully dissipated regardless of what you did to the ventilation. She came out of the stairwell into the main service corridor, where the federal technical team's equipment was visible through the open door of the primary server room 30 feet ahead. She turned left instead. The secondary access point was behind a false wall panel in the east mechanical room. Not sophisticated, not built with any particular care. The kind of thing that worked because nobody was looking for it. She pushed the panel open and moved through. On the other side was a narrow corridor that ran parallel to the main service corridor, feeding into a utility alcove behind the secondary server space. In the alcove, a man was crouched in front of a panel-mounted drive, his back to her, his hands moving fast. She recognized the shape of him. Raymond Caulfield, Westbrook's administrative director of operations, the man whose office was on the third floor, whose name appeared on every capital expenditure approval going back 9 years, who had shaken her hand on her first day and said welcome to Westbrook, with the particular warmth of someone who wanted to be liked and needed to be trusted. He heard her. He stood up and turned around. In his right hand was a drive he'd already pulled from the panel. In his left was a phone, which meant he'd either been on a call or was about to make one. His face, in the flat light of the utility alcove, was the face of a man who had run a very long way and had just discovered the distance wasn't enough. "Olivia," he said. And then, because some part of him understood the situation well enough to attempt it, "I can explain shit." "No," she said. "You can't." She kept her body in the doorway, not blocking it. She wasn't a federal agent and she didn't have the authority or the backup for a physical containment, but standing in it in a way that made the geometry of the room work against him, because the other exit was behind her and the alcove had no other outlet. "I need you to put the drive down," she said, "and put the phone on the floor, slowly." He looked at her. He looked at the drive. He looked at the phone. For a moment he calculated, and she could see him calculating, the way people do when they're trying to find the move that gets them out of a room they've already lost. She watched his eyes go to her, to the doorway, to the drive in his hand, back to her. "I have information," he said, "about the network. People you haven't found yet. I could put the drive down, Raymond." Behind her, she heard boots in the service corridor. The technical team, or Quan's people, or both. Caulfield heard it too. He set the drive on the floor. He put the phone next to it. He straightened up and looked at her with the specific expression of a man watching a version of his life end, and she felt no particular satisfaction in seeing it, just the flat certainty of a thing that had needed to happen, happening. "You were here when they installed it," she said. Not a question. She was putting it together as she said it. 14 months ago, the server in the sub-basement. You approved the installation. It was already approved. By Fitch. He didn't confirm or deny it, which was confirmation. "And then I arrived," she said, "and Gould ended up in the ER. And suddenly the thing you'd spent months making invisible was at risk of being traced, because a nurse had documented his phone in a hospital chart, and the chart was time-stamped and you couldn't pull it without flagging the access." He said nothing. "So you fed information to the network, told them what Gould had, told them where it was, told them who'd filed the chart." She paused. "You're the one who told them I'd taken the phone home." The boots in the corridor were close now. Caulfield looked at the drive on the floor. "Don't," she said quietly. He didn't. 3 agents came through the doorway behind her and moved past her with the efficient choreography of people who'd been in this situation before. And she stepped to the side to let them through, and she watched Raymond Caulfield put his hands behind his back without being asked, the automatic compliance of someone whose calculations had run all the way to the end. One of the agents picked up the drive, bagged it. The phone followed. Quan appeared in the doorway behind the agents and looked at the scene with an expression that had moved past controlled and into something genuine. Not quite relief, not quite satisfaction, but something in the narrow space between them. "Hayes," she said. "He was going for a secondary backup," Olivia said. "The drive's intact. I didn't touch anything." "How did you know about this room?" She looked at the false wall panel, still open, the narrow corridor behind it. "Someone showed me," she said. They walked her out through the main corridor, past the primary server room where the technical team was still working, past the stairwell where she'd come down, back up into the hospital that was still running. Patients still in rooms, nurses still on shift. the ER still managing whatever the night was bringing through its doors. She came out into the main corridor on the ground floor and stopped. The hallway was quiet in the way hospitals get quiet after 10 p.m. Not empty, but hushed. The particular hush of a building that contains sleeping people and vigilant ones. She could hear a monitor alarming softly somewhere down the wing, the automatic response of a nurse's station, the sound of it getting addressed. Normal. All of it, normal. She leaned against the wall, and for the first time since 4:47 in the morning, she let herself be still. Her phone had 3 missed calls. Marsh, an unknown number, and one from a Stonehaven area code she didn't recognize. She listened to Marsh's message first. Call me when you can, nothing urgent, all arrests are processing. The unknown number had left no message. The Stonehaven number turned out to be a reporter she'd never spoken to, which she deleted. She called Marsh. He answered on the first ring. Caulfield, she said. I know, Quan briefed me. A pause. That's the network. That's all of it. We've been through the organizational map 3 times tonight. Voss, Boone, Fitch, Caulfield, and 7 peripheral contacts who are in the process of being picked up. The ones from this morning's attack on Webb were located 40 minutes ago. What's the status on Webb? Stable. Concussion. He's going to be fine. She closed her eyes for a moment. Price? She asked. Cooperating fully. His testimony combined with the server data and the cargo documentation that survived the fires. It's enough. It's more than enough. The federal attorneys have been on the phone for 2 hours. This is going to trial, and it's going to stick. She opened her eyes. Marsh. Yeah. When does Gould wake up? He's already awake. He's been awake for 3 hours. He asked about you twice. I thought you said tomorrow morning. His doctors cleared him an hour ago. He's asking to talk tonight if you're willing. She looked down the corridor toward the ER, toward the elevator bank, toward the part of the hospital where a man who had set all of this in motion by being beaten behind a warehouse and carried to an ER by strangers was lying in a room asking for the nurse who documented his phone. Give me the room number, she said. Marsh gave it. She pushed off the wall. She took the elevator to the 4th floor, which was medical/surgical, which was quiet and dim in the way of nighttime hospital floors. The nurse's station had 2 people, both of whom looked up when she stepped out of the elevator, and one of whom she recognized vaguely from departmental overlap. Hayes, the nurse said, not surprised. Today had apparently made her name something people in this building recognized differently than they had this morning. Room 412, she said. Go ahead. She walked down the corridor. Room 412 was at the far end, and the door was partially open, and the light inside was the low amber of a room where someone is awake but not ready for fluorescence. She pushed the door open. Terrence Gould was 41 years old and had the appearance of someone who had spent 4 days in an ICU after being beaten into unconsciousness, which was exactly what he was. He was thin in the way of prolonged sedation, and there were monitoring leads still attached, and his head had been shaved on one side for a procedure she didn't know the details of. He looked at her when she came in. Lieutenant Hayes, he said. His voice was rough. Just Hayes, she said. She pulled the chair close to the bed and sat down. How are you feeling? Like someone used my head as an argument? A pause. I know what you did. With the phone. I documented it. Standard procedure. 14 people would disagree about it being standard. He looked at her with eyes that had the particular clarity of someone who'd spent 4 days in a sedated quiet and had been thinking since they woke up. I knew they were going to come for it. I thought the burner would disappear. I never thought... He stopped. I didn't expect the chart. You didn't expect a nurse who reads jacket linings. Something shifted in his face. No, I didn't. She looked at him for a moment, at the monitoring leads, the IV line, the half-shaved head, at the man who'd been Price's contact, who'd been trying to get information out of the port network, who'd ended up behind a warehouse because someone had figured out what he was carrying. The contact on the phone, she said, under the letter. You didn't access it? It was patient property. It was logged. He looked at the ceiling. You could have. Most people would have looked. I'm not most people. A long pause. The contact was a federal informant handler, he said. I'd been feeding information for 7 months. The night they found me, I'd tried to send a final package. Everything I had on the terminal documentation. I don't know if it went through. It did, she said. It became part of what they built the warrants on. He was quiet for a moment. They arrested Voss tonight, she said. He closed his eyes, opened them again. I know. The nurse who came in an hour ago told me. She stood up. You should rest. Hayes. He stopped her before she reached the door. The thing about the phone being in the chart, with the timestamp. He looked at her. It was the one thing they couldn't get around. Everything else, they had contingencies. They had people in place. But a hospital chart with a timestamp is a record that belongs to the patient. Not the hospital, not the police, not anyone with access to administrative systems. The patient. He paused. You knew that. She looked at him. I knew the procedures, she said. That's all. She walked out into the corridor and the door swung quietly behind her, and she stood in the amber-lit hallway of the 4th floor with the sound of monitors and the distant footsteps of a night shift nurse and the particular silence of a building full of people who were, most of them, going to be okay. Her phone buzzed, a message from an internal Westbrook number she recognized as the chief nursing officer's direct line. I know it's late. When you have a moment, my office tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. There are some things we need to discuss about your role here going forward. She put the phone back in her pocket. She walked to the elevator, pressed the button, waited. The doors opened. She stepped in and the elevator began to move. And somewhere in the building below her, in the administrative wing on the 3rd floor, in the office with the mahogany desk and the approved capital expenditure files going back 9 years, Raymond Caulfield's door was standing open and the fluorescent light inside was on, and the chair behind the desk was empty in the particular way of something that had been occupied for a long time and now wasn't. She looked at her reflection in the elevator's steel doors. A woman who had been thrown against a wall at 4:47 in the morning, suspended from her job by 9, running a mass casualty response by 10, giving federal testimony by noon, and was still, 16 hours later, standing upright. The elevator opened on the ground floor. She walked out through the ER, past the nurses' station, where 2 nurses looked up, and one of them said her name, not as a greeting exactly, but as an acknowledgement of something, and through the ambulance bay doors and out into the Stonehaven night. The air smelled of the port, faintly, the salt and diesel and the lingering edge of smoke that the wind hadn't finished dispersing. She stood on the concrete apron outside the ER and looked at the sky, which was dark enough now to show stars, the kind of stars you only see after the emergency lights have been cut and the crisis has passed its acute phase and the city is trying to remember how to breathe normally. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. The number was the Federal Field Office on Kellner Avenue, Quan's line. She answered. I thought you'd want to know immediately, Quan said. The secondary drive Caulfield was trying to reach. Our technical team has been into it for 40 minutes. It's not a backup of the server data. It's something else. Olivia waited. It's documentation, a separate set of records that Caulfield was keeping independently. Not for the network, for himself. Insurance probably, covering his own exposure. Quan paused. It includes communications going back 22 months, to people above Voss. The air felt different suddenly. How far above? Olivia said. Quan was quiet for a moment that stretched. Far enough, she said, that tomorrow morning is going to look very different from anything we planned for tonight. She stood on the concrete apron outside the ER for another 30 seconds after the call ended. Far enough. That was the phrase Quan had used, and it was the kind of phrase that came with weight attached. The weight of a case that had believed it knew its own boundaries and had just discovered it didn't. 22 months of documentation. People above Voss. The network wasn't a rogue operation run by a deputy commissioner with too much access and too little conscience. It was something that had been allowed to exist by people above him, something that had roots in offices where the carpets were better, and the accountability was designed to be harder to reach. She put her phone in her pocket and went to her car. She drove home to Calloway Street, where the door to her house had been replaced sometime during the day. A temporary fix, new frame, the wood pale and unweathered against the old paint. She didn't know who had arranged it, Marsh probably, or one of the federal support staff who handled the peripheral logistics of situations like this. She stood in her hallway and looked at the new door for a moment. Then she went to bed. Because there was nothing else to do tonight and she'd been awake for 22 hours, and whatever tomorrow looked like, she needed to be functional for it. She was asleep in 4 minutes. The morning came in at 6:43 through a window she'd forgotten to close the curtain on. She lay still for a moment, looking at the ceiling, cataloging the day before with the particular clarity that sometimes comes after crisis sleep, the compressed, efficient unconsciousness of someone whose nervous system had nothing left to spend on dreaming. The bruise on her arm was fully expressed now, dark purple, edged in yellow, occupying the space from her mid-forearm to her elbow. She looked at it while the coffee brewed. Not with anger, exactly, with something more factual, an objective record of what had happened, written on her own skin. She drank the coffee standing at the kitchen window, looking at the street where 4 SUVs and a patrol car had parked at 5 in the morning 2 days ago. The street looked like a street. The neighbors' cars were in their driveways. Mrs. Farrow's porch light was still on, which meant either she'd forgotten to turn it off or she'd been up early. And with Mrs. Farrow, it was an even split. At 7:15, she got dressed and drove to Westbrook. The chief nursing officer was a woman named Dr. Carla Osei, who had run Westbrook's nursing operations for 11 years with a directness that Olivia had respected immediately and from a distance. They had not had many direct conversations. Osei was not a person who invited frequent direct conversations. She communicated clearly in writing, rarely repeated herself, and expected the same in return. Her office was on the 5th floor, which was administration, and at 8 in the morning it already had the hum of a floor that had received difficult news and was processing it at speed. 2 people were in the hallway talking in the lowered tones of professional crisis management. Someone had taped a sheet of paper over the nameplate outside Caulfield's office, which was 3 doors down from Osei's. Osei was at her desk. She gestured at the chair across from her when Olivia came in, and Olivia sat, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "I'll say the direct thing first," Osei said. "What happened to you 2 days ago should not have happened. The suspension was improper. The manner of your removal from this building was improper. The board reviewed everything last night, and the formal rescission is already in your file." She paused. "That's the institutional language. Personally, I'm sorry. We failed you." Olivia looked at her. "I appreciate that." "The direct thing second." Osei put her hands flat on the desk. "Dr. Hart has submitted his resignation. He's not being forced out. He offered it, and the board accepted it. The director of emergency medicine position is temporarily vacant, and the department head role will be restructured." She held Olivia's gaze. "The board wants to discuss the director of emergency trauma position with you. Formal appointment, clinical authority over the ER and mass casualty protocols. It would mean moving out of the floor rotation." Olivia had known something like this was coming. In the abstract, the way you know weather is coming when the air has a certain quality. Still, hearing the specific words in the specific order made them land differently than the abstract. "I want to think about it," she said. Osei nodded. She'd expected that. "You have time, but the offer isn't conditional on an immediate answer." A pause. "For what it's worth, and I say this having watched you work in this building for over a year, you've been doing the job without the title since you arrived. The title would just make the authority legible to people who need that clarity." Olivia looked out the window at the Stonehaven skyline, which had the particular flatness of a city that had absorbed something large and was still figuring out what shape to hold. "Marcus Webb," she said. "He was assaulted on hospital property while providing information to federal investigators about activity that was facilitated through hospital administrative systems. I want to know what the institution is doing about that." Osei didn't flinch. "He's receiving full compensation during his recovery. The board has approved a formal acknowledgement of his cooperation, and our legal department is in contact with the federal team about his potential role as a protected witness should the case go to trial." "It will go to trial," Olivia said. "Multiple trials. Then we'll make sure he's supported through it." Osei paused. "He also told me this morning, I called to check on him, that you're the reason he knew anything was wrong in the first place. He said that to me unprompted." Olivia stood. "I'll give you my answer about the position by end of week." Osei nodded. She left. Cheb. The first trial began 9 weeks later. Not Voss, His case was the largest and took longer to prepare. The first trial was the two men who had attacked Marcus on the loading dock, and it lasted 4 days, and it established the factual record of the assault, the connection to the network, and the chain of instruction that led from Marcus's conversation with Kwan's team to a loading dock behind Westbrook's East Wing. Both men were convicted. The sentencing was 6 and 8 years respectively, consecutive on the assault and conspiracy counts, and Olivia read about it in a news summary on her phone while eating lunch in the Westbrook cafeteria, and Marcus, who was sitting across from her with a coffee and a face that had healed into something only slightly asymmetric, the scar above his ear still visible, probably permanent, looked at her over his cup. 6 and 8, he said. For starters, she said. He drank his coffee. You know what I keep thinking about? Tell me. The way it felt when Hart called me up to his office, before they got me outside. He turned the cup in his hands. I thought he was going to thank me for cooperating with the federal team. I walked up there thinking that. She looked at him. I walked up there trusting the institution, he said. And the institution had already passed my name to someone who was using it to make a phone call. He set the cup down. That's the part that doesn't go away fast. No, she said, it doesn't. How do you hold that, trusting the system enough to work in it, knowing it can do that? She thought about the answer before she gave it, because he deserved a real one and not a convenient one. You don't trust the system. You trust the people in it who are worth trusting, and you build the record carefully enough that the system can't ignore what you've documented. She paused. And you accept that sometimes doing the right thing means you're going to get hurt before you're vindicated. There's no version of what I did with Gould's phone that was going to be painless. He looked at her for a long moment. Most people would have let the phone go. Most people didn't spend 4 years in places where letting go of the right detail gets someone killed, she said. I'm not most people. I know that. I've made my peace with it. He picked up his coffee again. The director position. I said yes. He smiled, carefully because of the scar. I know. Osei told me. I just wanted to hear you say it. The Voss trial opened in federal court on a Tuesday morning in November, in a building downtown that had the architecture of institutional permanence, marble floors, high ceilings, the weight of a structure built to communicate that the process inside it was meant to outlast individuals. Olivia testified on the third day. She had testified in courts before, in contexts she was not able to describe in this one, and she understood the specific discipline of it, the restraint of saying exactly what you know and not what you feel, of letting the record carry the weight instead of your voice. She answered Kwan's questions in the precise order they were asked. She described Gould's admission, the documentation, the phone, the timestamp, the visitor who asked about the wrong things. She described the raid. She described the assault and the suspension and the staging area and the patients and what she'd found at the end of an 11-minute drive to a hospital loading dock. She didn't editorialize. She didn't need to. The defense attorney tried twice to suggest that her military background made her predisposed to suspicion, to over-documentation, to interpreting civilian situations through a lens that distorted their significance. She answered both attempts with the same even composure that had been the thing Boone had found most disconcerting on Calloway Street. And the courtroom, which had the quality of a room watching something happen that it will remember, was very quiet during both exchanges. The jury was out for 19 hours. Aldrich Voss was convicted on 11 counts, including conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and 2 counts directly connected to the network's involvement in the port explosions through the people he had protected and enabled. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for January. Raymond Caulfield, whose independent documentation turned out to be the most comprehensive single record of the network's operations above Voss's level, negotiated a cooperation agreement that required his full testimony in exchange for a reduced sentence. He was sentenced to 9 years. He would serve 7. He gave them 4 names above Voss. Those 4 names produced 4 more federal investigations in 3 states. And the Stonehaven case became, within the federal system, the kind of reference point that investigators cited when they were trying to explain how something this large can be brought down by a chain of events that started with a nurse correctly logging patient property. Lenora Fitch was convicted on conspiracy and financial fraud charges and sentenced to 4 years. She served 3. Derek Boone was convicted on civil rights violation charges, assault under color of authority, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. He was sentenced to 5 years. The day the verdict came in, the footage from Callaway Street ran again on every major platform in the state. The neighbor's video, the blue shirt, the pale light of a street at 5 in the morning, and the comment sections filled with the particular energy of people who had been watching and waiting for a specific word. The word was guilty. Captain Drummond was not convicted. The investigation found insufficient evidence that she had known the full scope of what she'd authorized, only that she'd been complicit in a process she hadn't fully interrogated when she should have. She retired. The department restructuring that followed was the most significant in Stonehaven PD's history, and its oversight was placed partially in the hands of a federal monitoring board that would report quarterly for 5 years. Okay. The civilian award ceremony happened on a Friday in December, in a hall that was not as grand as the occasion probably deserved, but was the hall that was available, and Olivia stood at the back of it before the program started and thought about how much she disliked ceremonies, and had always disliked them, even the ones in other contexts, even the ones that meant something. Terrence Gould was in the front row. He was upright, healthier, still visibly carrying the aftermath of what had happened to him, because bodies don't finish processing those things on a schedule that fits around public events. He'd shaken her hand in the hallway before the program and held on to it for a moment longer than a handshake required, and hadn't said anything, and she hadn't required anything to be said. Alan Price was not present. He was in a witness protection arrangement that had moved him out of Stonehaven, and she didn't know where he was, and that was appropriate. Marcus was in the third row, the scar above his ear catching the light, wearing a jacket she'd never seen him wear before and would probably not see again. He tried to pretend he wasn't moved by being there. He had not succeeded. Captain Rains was there, in uniform. They'd spoken twice since the port sight. Brief conversations about the mass casualty response, about what had worked and what hadn't. Rains was building a career on the right foundations. Olivia had said as much in the letter she'd written to Marcia's superiors when they'd asked for her assessment. The award itself was a formal thing, the National Civilian Medal for Public Service, which was less important than the words attached to it, which acknowledged specifically, and for the first time in a public record, her military service, her prior designation, and her role in an operation that the citation described as preventing further loss of life in a coordinated attack on a civilian population. The redactions in the citation covered roughly 40% of the actual content. That was fine. She knew what was underneath them. When she stood at the podium to receive it, she looked at the room, at Gould in the front row, at Marcus in the third, at Rains in her uniform, at Quan standing near the back wall with the particular stillness of someone who preferred to be finished with formal events, at Marsh near the exit because Marsh always positioned himself near exits, at Mrs. Farrow, who had somehow been invited and was sitting in the fifth row with the specific upright alertness of someone who had not expected to be at a ceremony like this, but was committed to being worthy of it. She did not make a speech. She had been asked to make a speech and had declined, and the program had moved on around that decision. But she held the award in her hands for a moment before stepping back from the podium, and she looked at it, not at the room, at the object itself, and she thought about what it represented, which was not her strength exactly, not her training, not even her choices, though all of those things were part of it. What it represented was a phone, logged correctly, time-stamped, filed in a chart that belonged to a patient and therefore could not be touched. Procedure, documentation, the work that exists before the crisis that makes the crisis survivable. She stepped back from the podium, and the room did what rooms do, and she accepted that. And then she sat down. She took the director position officially on the first Monday of the new year. The title came with an office she immediately determined she would use primarily for paperwork, and a mandate to rebuild the ER's mass casualty protocols from the ground up, incorporating the lessons of the port response. She had notes on that already. She'd been taking them since the morning she'd stood over Alan Price's photograph and read an injury pattern across 2 timelines. The notes were thorough and unsentimental, and built from what had actually happened rather than what should have happened according to a manual. She hired Rains as a consultant on the protocol revision, which was partly professional judgment and partly something else. A recognition that Rains had adapted fast under pressure, had taken direction without ego, and had done her job well in conditions that would have justified falling apart. Those qualities were worth investing in, and the investment would pay out not to Olivia, but to whoever Rains treated in the next 30 years, and that was the point. Marcus came back in February, after his recovery, and came back to the night shift by choice, which surprised nobody who knew him. He stopped by her office on his first night back, knocked on the open door, stood in it with his coffee cup. "You look ridiculous behind a desk," he said. "I spend 4 hours a night in the ER and 4 hours behind the desk," she said. "The ER doesn't get a paperwork break." "How's the protocol document?" 63 pages? That's too many pages. That's exactly as many pages as it needs to be. He smiled. The scar had softened slightly, still visible, always going to be. "You know what this floor was like before you came?" "I have some idea." "It was a good ER. People did good work." He looked at the cup. "But nobody ran it the way you run it. The way you read a room, the way you know before anything's happened that something's about to... That's not training, Olivia. Or it's not only training." She looked at him. "What's your point, Marcus?" "My point is that what they tried to do, the suspension, the raid, the public humiliation, all of it, they were trying to take that out of this building, and they failed." He raised the cup slightly, a small gesture. "That's worth noting." She looked at him for a moment. "Go do your rounds," she said. He went. In April, Derek Boone arrived at Harker Federal Correctional Facility to begin his sentence, and the footage from Calloway Street ran one more time, not on the news, but across the social platforms that had carried it from the beginning. The neighbor's video, 22 seconds, the blue shirt, the pale street, the moment before the SUVs arrived. 2.4 million views in the first 12 hours had become, by April, something considerably larger. She didn't watch it. She was in the ER when she heard about his arrival, standing at the nurse's station, reviewing a chart on a patient in Bay 3 who needed a decision made about his discharge. She heard a resident mention it, and she looked up briefly and then looked back at the chart. She made the discharge decision, moved to the next chart. That was all. That was the right amount of attention to give it. Not nothing, because ignoring consequences is its own kind of dishonesty, but not more than a moment, because a moment was all it warranted. What Boone faced now was a process, and the process was running correctly, and her job was not to watch it run, but to do her own work. Her own work was this floor, these patients, this ER that was now, officially and with institutional weight behind it, hers to shape. She'd been shaping it for 16 months already. Well, there are things people say about strength, most of them inadequate. They talk about it like it's a resource you accumulate. Like if you suffer enough, endure enough, you build up a reserve that protects you from the next thing. That's not what it is. What it actually is, the functional version, is more like a skill than a resource. The ability to keep doing the right thing in a sequence, even when each individual step costs something, even when the cost isn't distributed fairly, even when the people who should be protecting you are the ones making the sequence harder. Olivia Hayes had not been strong because she was exceptional. She had been strong because she had learned, in conditions that don't exist in most people's lives, that the alternative, stopping, going quiet, letting the thing pass, doesn't actually make you safer. It just makes the next thing worse. The night she'd logged Terrence Gould's phone, she hadn't been thinking about courage or justice or the structural implications of patient property rights. She'd been tired and she'd had 4 hours left on her shift, and she'd seen something that needed to be documented, and she'd documented it. That was all. The chain of everything that followed was not a vindication of some particular quality she possessed. It was a vindication of procedure, of the mundane discipline of doing the small things correctly when nobody is watching, because the record you build in those moments is the only one that can't be taken from you. She was 31 years old. She had been a soldier, and she had stopped being a soldier, and she had become something else. And the thing she'd become had turned out to have its own kind of battlefield, with its own kind of stakes, that she hadn't fully understood until a door came off its hinges at 4:47 in the morning, and she'd been required to account for who she was. She had accounted for it. That was enough. On a Thursday evening in early May, she was in Bay 7 working with a first-year resident on a pediatric case. A 9-year-old with a tricky presentation that the resident had flagged correctly but wasn't sure how to move on, when Marcus appeared at the curtain. "There's someone at the desk for you," he said, "not a patient." "I'm in the middle of something." "I know, but you should probably—" He paused. "It's Gould." She looked at the resident. "You have this. Walk me through your differential when I come back." The resident nodded with the concentrated seriousness of someone trying not to show how much they appreciated being trusted. She went to the desk. Terrence Gould was standing at the edge of the ER's waiting area, not waiting, standing with the body language of someone who had come for a specific purpose and was managing the discomfort of an ER waiting room by focusing on the purpose rather than the room. He was dressed in regular clothes. He looked better than he had at the ceremony in December. He looked like a man who was putting weight back on, which was what recovery looked like from the outside. Incremental, unglamorous, real. "I should have called," he said. "It's fine." She gestured toward the corridor off the waiting area, away from the noise. They walked there. "What do you need?" "Nothing." He looked at her. "I wanted to tell you something. In person, not in a courtroom, not at a ceremony." He looked down at the floor briefly, then back up. "I've been thinking about what to say for 4 months, and I still don't have it exactly right, so I'm going to just say it." "Go ahead." "I was a piece in a larger operation. I knew some of what I was carrying and not all of it. I thought I was helping end something, and I ended up nearly dead in an alley because the people I was trying to expose were 3 moves ahead of everyone." He paused. "What you did, not the testimony, not any of the public record, what you did was you logged a phone in a chart, a small thing. And that small thing was the one thing they couldn't plan around because they didn't expect someone to care that much about the small thing." She looked at him. "I'm not trying to give you a compliment," he said. "I'm trying to tell you that you saved my life by doing your job. Not your military job, your nurse job, the job they tried to take from you 2 days later." He let out a slow breath. "I wanted you to know that that's what I think of when I think of what happened." The ER noise was steady in the background, the ambient sound of a floor that never fully rests. Monitors, voices, the particular rhythm of a system that processes human crisis at volume and tries to do it with care. She looked at Gould for a moment. "Take care of yourself," she said. He nodded. He knew, she thought, that this was her version of receiving what he'd said, not dismissing it, not elaborating on it, but acknowledging it in the only way that felt honest. She was not built for the aftermath of recognition. She had always been built for the next patient. He left. She went back to Bay 7. The resident had her differential ready, and it was mostly right, and the part that wasn't right was instructive, and they worked through it together while the 9-year-old watched them both with the focused patience of a child who had decided to trust the people in the room because the room had not given her a reason not to. By the end of the shift, the child had been diagnosed, treated, and sent home with her parents, and a clear plan and a resident who would remember this case for a long time, because the attending had made her feel capable instead of small. Olivia drove home to Calloway Street at 7 in the morning, the sun already up, the street already going about its life. She parked in front of the house with the door that had been replaced, properly now, matching paint, new hardware, and sat for a moment without getting out of the car. She thought about what Gould had said, about the small thing, the phone in the chart, the timestamp, the procedure that nobody notices when it goes right and everybody needs when something goes wrong. There is a version of this story that is about what happens to people who underestimate the wrong person. That version is satisfying in the way that a certain kind of story is satisfying. Clean reversal, revealed strength, deserved consequence. It's not wrong. But the version she lived in was about something simpler and less cinematic. It was about a nurse who logged a phone correctly at the end of a long shift because she had learned, in places and in ways she didn't discuss, that the record is the only thing that outlasts the people trying to erase it. She'd been underestimated. She'd been removed from her position, dragged through her own hallway, suspended in the morning, and reinstated by evening. She'd stood over 23 patients on a triage board and brought the number down to 0 before anyone in the hospital that had suspended her was done processing what they'd done. None of that made her exceptional. It made her someone who had done the job. The hardest thing she'd learned was not surviving the crisis. The hardest thing was continuing to show up for the ordinary work after the crisis was over. The charting, the protocol revision, the 63-page document that would probably be read by 12 people and save the lives of people who would never know its name. Showing up for the ordinary work without resentment, without performance, without waiting for someone to notice. She got out of the car, walked to the front door, put her key in the lock. Behind her, on Calloway Street, the morning continued without requiring anything more from her. Children going to school, the sound of a neighbor's car starting, Mrs. Farrow's porch light finally off, the ordinary world moving through its ordinary rhythms, intact, unbothered, and full of people who would need someone like her before the year was out. She went inside. She made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table with the cup she hadn't finished 2 months ago and the morning light coming through the window she'd forgotten to close the curtain on. And she was still. And the house was quiet. And outside the door she'd had replaced was a street and a city and a life that had tried, for a moment, to convince her she didn't belong in it. She belonged in it. She had always belonged in it. The coffee was hot, and she drank it, and that was enough.